webinar, From the Global to the Local, Strategies for State and Local Human Rights Implementation. I'm Yolande Tomlinson, the National Education Coordinator for the U.S. Human Rights Network, and I'm very happy to be back after being away on maternity leave. So as many of you know, the network who are working to build and strengthen a people-centered human rights movement and culture in the U.S. As a network, leadership is centered on those most directly affected by human rights violations, and the full range of diversity in communities is respected and embraced. So this webinar is hosted by the ICCPR Task Force, which is an all-volunteer group of advocates who support members and partners engaging with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which, as you all know, is only one of 3 human rights treaties that the U.S. has accepted as law. So a couple of things to note before we get started on the presentation today. The first is that the call is currently in lecture mode. Everyone except the presenters will be muted until we open up the call for conversation, and at which point you can participate in the conversation through 2 ways. The first is by using the raise hand feature, and you will see that if you click on it, it will take you down to the second option, which is the raise hand feature, and that's the way we'll recognize you to then unmute you to ask your question. The second is via the chat box on your left, and it allows you the options to send a question to us that we can either answer by typing in the chat, or later on in the Q&A session, writing. The presenters can respond verbally to you. So in terms of our agenda for today, we have the following: an introduction of our panelists and speakers, and then the panel itself, which is a discussion on the strategies for advocating at the state and local levels. And then we'll feature, as a case study, an example of how folks have been able to put, ACLU Mexico specifically, has been able to put in practice the concluding open up for a Q&A from you all. And we invite you at that point to share strategies that you find successful or ask for more information from our speakers. And last, we'll end with a list of resources based on today's conversation that are currently on our website, and there will also be a link in the PowerPoint as well. So in terms of our panel discussion, we have 4 or 5 speakers who'll be addressing the issue of today's topic. And the panel is moderated by Jamil Dakwar, who is not only the co-chair of the ICCPR Task Force, but the director of the Human Rights Program in the ACLU. And I won't go into Jamil's full bio nor any of the speakers, which is also available on our resource page that you can read in full. Our list of speakers include Angelo Pinto, who is the campaign manager for Raise the Age campaign of the Correctional Association of New York's Juvenile Justice Project, and he works at the Correctional Association of New York. We also have Retha Kaufman, who's on our top right, who's executive director of Columbia Law School Human Rights Institute. In the bottom left, we have Katrina Anderson, Senior Human Rights Counsel at the Center for Reproductive Rights. In our middle, we have Farah Tanis, who's the co-director, who's the co-founder and executive director of Black Women's Blueprint, and hopefully who'll be joining us soon, Toussaint Losieux, who's the vice chairman of Chicago Anti-Eviction Campaign. So I'm going to turn it over now to Jamil, who will frame the panel conversation for us, and then begin the conversation with our panelists.
Thank you very much, Yolande, for this introduction, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. My name is Jamil Dakwar. I'm the director of the ACLU Human Rights Program, and I've been also co-chairing the ICCPR Task Force. I'm really excited to be part of this webinar because it's an opportunity for us to come together after 2 exciting reviews by the United States government at the United Nations. The first, as you all know, the review before the Human Rights Committee that was last spring under the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And the second, more recent one was just last summer, over the summer, in August, before the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And we have today with us, as Yolande mentioned, people who were engaged in these 2 reviews. We thought that this webinar would provide an opportunity to highlight some of the successes, challenges in using the concluding observations, the outcome documents that these 2 treaty bodies, the Human Rights Committee and the Committee on the elimination of racial discrimination produced after they reviewed the U.S. delegation, after they heard from many of you who were part of these reviews. And the time now comes to, and kind of the burden is shifted back to us, to civil society, to organizations working on many different issues that were covered by these reviews in holding the U.S. government accountable. Now, the question that is always raised, does these treaties apply only to the federal government and its officials, or they apply to all levels of governments, state, local governments? And why is it then, if the answer is yes, it applies to all levels of the government, why is it that the U.S. government is only engaging us at the federal level, much less people from the state and local governments? I have to say, though, that we have noticed, because of the advocacy, the successful advocacy of many of you, that we have seen the U.S. government incorporating state and local officials. It's very limited participation by a couple of attorney generals, other state and local agencies, but it's a positive indication that the U.S. government is realizing the importance of engaging these governments. But as a matter of a principle, and I think that is something that is in all the human rights treaties, including the ICCPR and CERD, the provisions of the covenants of the treaties extend to all parts of federal states without, and again I'm quoting here, without any limitations or exceptions. This is Article 50, for example, of the ICCPR. There's a specific direct language in these treaties. So the treaties don't apply only to the federal government. And as far as international law, as far as these human rights bodies, they treat the United States as a whole. The responsibilities of the U.S. government, the federal government, is to ensure that the treaty is implemented at all levels. And we will hear more on that from Risa. The one thing, though, that it's important to keep in mind is that when the U.S. ratified the human rights treaties in the early 90s, it added a declaration to its ratification so that it would explain or describe and clarify the way that the United States government will implement its treaty obligations. In the context of the ICCPR in 1992, when the U.S. ratified the treaty, it said the understanding that was entered by the Senate when it was ratified, the treaty was ratified, recognized the federal system of the government as specifically that the treaty shall be implemented matters covered by the treaty, and otherwise by the state and local governments with support from the federal government for the fulfillment of the covenant. So you have a clear indication that the U.S. government is not absolving itself from responsibility to implement the treaty, but is rather describing or clarifying the way that it will be done consistent with our federal system. So with that in mind, I think we're really important to figure out how do we engage state and local governments? How do we sometimes pressure or leverage the fact that the federal government is actually doing a good job? It has some good policies or some good practices that could impact the state and local practices, or vice versa, when you have state and local practices that are sometimes more progressive, far more protective of human rights than the federal government policies. How do we leverage those practices to the extent that will help ensure that the federal government is fulfilling its obligations under the treaties? So with us today, we're going to start with Risa Kaufman, who is the director of the Human Rights Institute. And Risa and her colleagues at the Institute are really spearheading the important work of engaging with state and local governments and agencies on how best to incorporate and implement human rights obligations. They've done a lot of research, issued documents, including advocacy, direct advocacy with treaty bodies, And they have been doing this also as part of the Human Rights at Home campaign, which is a campaign that the U.S. Human Rights Network is organizing civil society to push for infrastructure, human rights infrastructure here at home. So I want to start by asking Risa, given your pioneer work on looking at ways to engage state and local government, if you can give us a sense of what the Human Rights Institute is doing nowadays, and what are the opportunities that you're seeing in engaging state and local governments in implementing the treaty body's recommendations that came out last spring and August.
Sure, great. Can you hear me, Jamil? I want to make sure.
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thanks. First, I just really want to thank you and the U.S. Human Rights Network and the ICCPR Task Force for the tremendous work that you all are doing and for organizing this webinar and inviting my participation. I'm really excited to engage in this conversation. So just as a threshold, I imagine everybody on this call knows that state and local officials are on the front lines of human rights implementation. And if they're not, they should be, right? Because many of the human rights concerns that are covered under the treaties fall within the jurisdiction of state and local governments: criminal justice, violence against women, housing, education, et cetera. And as Jamil noted, the U.S. ratifies human rights treaties, or the few that it has ratified, in a way that delegates implementation to state and local government, although the federal government retains ultimate responsibility for U.S. compliance. So with that background, the Columbia Law School Human Rights Institute has been working to build the capacity of state and local governments to implement their human rights treaty obligations, while at the same time advocating for federal support and coordination for the important work that state and local governments are doing. At the same time, continuing to encourage state and local governments to do more. And as Jamil also noted, we're doing this work under the auspices of the Human Rights at Home campaign, and also in partnership with many wonderful organizations, including many who are represented on this panel and who I see are participating in this webinar today. So this is all in partnership and collaboration. Through this work, we found that human rights can offer a very strong framework for articulating local concerns and for holding local officials accountable. And our perspective on this work, we engage in this with the assumption that state and local governments are allies in this work. And what our hope is that what we're doing is laying a groundwork for the important work that many people on this call and participating in this webinar are then doing at the local level to advocate directly with state and local officials. So specifically, we're working through associations of state and local officials to identify human rights champions who can then spread the message that can advance equality and eradicate systemic discrimination at the state and local level. We're working with an organization called IORA, the International Association of Official Human Rights Agencies, which is the umbrella organization of state and local human rights commissions, as well as with state and local agencies individually. We're working through the U.S. Conference of Mayors and certain mayors' offices who we've identified as champions and who are interested in this work. And we're beginning to engage in outreach with the National Association of Attorneys Generals and with specific states' attorneys general. So this work that we're doing by necessity is focused broadly. We're really building capacity and trying to respond to the needs of local officials and the issues that they're working on. And as I said, we're trying to prime them for further engagement with human rights by other advocates. So ours is not an adversarial approach, but rather one where we're offering ourselves up as a resource to provide education and technical support. And we're hoping to develop and support new models and strategies to integrate human rights at the local level. And we found, of course, that community partnerships and community support are really essential in this effort. We're also learning that messaging around equality, innovation, dignity, and opportunity is very well received by state and local officials. We try to emphasize that human rights are beneficial because they can add value to what state and local officials are already doing. They can put a focus on proactively identifying and addressing problems. They can empower and elevate public service and good governance. A human rights framework can foster partnerships and promote inclusivity. They can enhance responsiveness and accountability, and they can emphasize addressing systemic causes, systemic roots of discrimination. And they can also provide state and local officials with an opportunity to demonstrate their leadership locally, nationally, and on the global stage, which can be very attractive to many officials. So we're finding that a number of human rights strategies are taking hold in individual jurisdictions as well. And again, really credit the amazing work that lots of advocates are doing to really engage directly with their officials around this. So some examples, we've identified some broad categories of what state and local officials are doing. They're monitoring, documenting, and reporting on human rights compliance. They're making aspirational commitments to human rights. They're reframing local concerns as human rights issues. They're conducting human rights-based audits and impact assessments, and they're developing more participatory approaches to policymaking. So I'll give a few examples. In recent years, a number, I believe it's up to 11 cities and counties, have adopted resolutions declaring freedom from domestic violence as a human right. And several of these resolve for government to use human rights principles in their work or call on the government to assess existing solutions and recommend change. A number of cities have passed ordinances committing to uphold the principles of the Women's Rights Convention, CEDAW. San Francisco, of course, was the first, passing an ordinance that requires that city agencies go through gender assessments and review the city's policies and practices to ensure that their programs are meeting the needs of women and girls. And through this analysis, the San Francisco Commission on the Status of Women identified discriminatory practices and barriers to employment and helped a number of departments institute policies to correct these. A number of governments are using broader human rights assessments and audits to assess changes in policy and improve decision-making. A great example here is Eugene, Oregon, which has introduced what they call the triple bottom line tool, which analyzes proposed policy and program changes for their potential impacts on human rights. And it's led to a greater focus, for example, on health and fitness in certain budgetary decisions. Cities are passing homeless persons' bills of rights. January 2014, Duluth, Minnesota became the first city to do this. And that resolution acknowledges the importance of ensuring an adequate standard of living, including food, clothing, and housing, which is a core element of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it sets up mechanisms to focus on eliminating hunger, homelessness, and poverty. In 2014, the statewide Human Rights Commission held a series of human rights hearings and called for public comment on the state of human rights in Tennessee, at which leaders from community organizations, government, advocacy groups, and researchers testified. And their aim is to collect all of that testimony into a report on the state of human rights in Tennessee. Of course, there are a number of limitations with many of these initiatives. The resolutions in particular often lack teeth. A number of these are at the very nascent stages, but I would argue that one of the biggest limitations, as Jamil alluded to, is that there's really no federal coordination or support for this. So, of course, in an ideal world, we'd have federal infrastructure that would coordinate and support state and local implementation. It should come as no surprise to many of you that the U.S. doesn't have a national human rights institution that monitors human rights compliance across the country, and there's no one focal point within the federal government that supports and coordinates state and local implementation. Through the Human Rights at Home campaign and with many other organizations, we're advocating for more federal coordination and support of state and local human rights implementation. And importantly, we're pushing the federal government to strengthen state and local compliance through education, training, and samples, some of which I've identified here at the state and local level, to really help states and local governments identify these things and learn from one another. So we're making some headway. The federal government is engaging state and local officials more in the treaty review process. It's thinking through how to engage state and local human rights commissions and other state and local actors through federal partnerships like the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and the Department of Housing and Urban Development, but it really needs to do more. So, for example, the federal government needs to disseminate the very strong concluding observations that the treaty bodies have recently issued to state and local officials and really provide them with some robust guidance on the relevance of the state and local policy, of the concluding observations to state and local policy and practice. But until it does so, it's really on us, the advocates, to engage more directly with state and local officials. So I think I'll end there, and I'm happy to answer any questions or talk more, but I'm really eager to hear about the important work that other folks are doing.
Great. Thank you so much, Risa. And I think there was, in the chat, there was a couple of questions already directed, I think, to you. And one, just the technical one, is just to repeat IORA, what it stands for, is the one that the local and state human rights agencies.
Oh, sure. So it's the International Association of Official Human Rights Agencies.
Right. And I think the other question was, which is something that I wanted to ask you, is just a follow-up. Maybe you can briefly answer it. The challenge of enforcing human rights at the state and local level. Obviously, this is not a problem for the state and local level. I mean, we have the same problem with federal on the federal level, whether it's federal courts or even enforcing some of those treaties on the executive branch itself. Can you say something about the challenges of enforcing human rights at the local and state level, and how that is playing out in the U.S. as compared to other countries? Just briefly, if you can.
Sure. I mean, we can have a much larger conversation. The challenges of enforcing human rights within the U.S. are huge, right, because of the way in which we ratify treaties so that you can't go into court and claim a violation of a human rights treaty directly. But I guess I would encourage us all to think much more broadly about how we enforce human rights, and think more broadly about it as holding governments accountable for their human rights obligations. And accountability and holding governments accountable can take many different forms, which I really imagine that other folks on this panel are going to talk about, right? It's about naming and shaming. It's calling attention to human rights violations at the global level, at the national level, at the local level. It's inviting the federal government to step up and take action to enforce domestic protections that are consistent with human rights violations. So there's a whole broad array of ways in which we as advocates can hold state and local governments and the federal government accountable for its human rights commitments and obligations, short of going into court to enforce a right in court. But then, of course, we can talk about litigation as well, and advocates are thinking of all sorts of creative ways in which we can bring these concluding observations, for example, into federal court and into state court to really inform a court's consideration of domestic law. So, advocates have been doing this for years, bringing in treaty law and customary international law. And as we are developing more and more specific and targeted concluding observations that are focusing specifically on U.S. violations, I think it opens up a whole lot of really interesting opportunities for us to think about how we can present those concluding observations to state courts and to federal courts for them to consider how the U.S. is living up to its human rights commitments, again, as persuasive authority in considering how state actors are meeting their obligations under federal, state, and local law.
Great. Thanks so much, Risa. This is very, very helpful. So I want to move to the next speaker, Katrina Anderson, who is a Senior Human Rights Counsel with the Center for Reproductive Rights. And Katrina has been working on reproductive rights issues for many years, and I've had the privilege to work with her at the UN level on some of domestic advocacy, and really, what's come to mind, when we talk about issues like reproductive health and reproductive rights in general, this is a very, very difficult issue to engage sometimes state and local governments, given that more often you have state governments and legislatures that are actually anti-reproductive rights. So I wanted to ask you, from your own experience engaging at the local, state, and international level, how did you engage these reviews? How did you use the UN review processes, the concluding observations that come out of this, including your partnership with the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health, to address the health crisis, particularly among immigrant women in the Rio Grande Valley in Texas?
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Jamil. I'm happy to be here. I think this is a really important webinar that the network has organized. So yeah, let me approach your question by first giving a little bit of an explanation of the problem, because as you mentioned, reproductive rights are issues of both federal and state law, and so it's important to sort of understand the problem before I talk a little bit about how we're using the reviews. In terms of what's happening with immigrants' health, access to health care, immigrants are excluded from many benefits under the Affordable Care Act, and so we definitely have a federal issue just right out of the gate. The immigrants who are undocumented have no access to Medicaid. They can't buy insurance on the new exchanges. And even those immigrants who are lawfully in the United States must wait for 5 years before they can access Medicaid. So you have this mandatory waiting period. And we argue that these policies on their face are discriminatory on grounds of immigration status. And when you bring an intersectionality analysis into it, they have a huge impact on immigrant women, especially those who are low income, which is the majority of them, because they don't have insurance through private employers, and they often can't afford to buy it on their own. But of course, all of this depends on the state and where you live, and so this is where the state policy comes into play. Your access is much worse in states like Texas that are attacking reproductive rights right and left, right? In New York, immigrant women have many opportunities under different state programs to access reproductive health care. But in Texas, and then when you get more specifically into very poor and rural regions like the Rio Grande Valley on the border of Mexico, women lack access to health care almost entirely. Through the partnership of our national ally, the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health. And they have a group of women that they've been working with for quite some time now, many years, organizing them along the border, doing basic reproductive health care education, and also trying to do sort of grassroots mobilization work with them and civic engagement. And so they had lots of women who were saying to them, look, we used to be able to have at least some access to family planning clinics where we could get contraception and some forms of care, but now we have nothing. And so what they were seeing is a huge, as a result of major state budget cuts in 2011, they had all these clinics were closing. They had no access to contraception. They couldn't get cancer screenings. They couldn't get testing for HIV and other basic care. So their health was really starting to suffer, and it affected a whole range of their rights. So we partnered with them to do a documentation project, and that was completed in November of 2013. We released a report, which people can access on our website. It's called nuestrotexas.org, and so it was it was framed in a human rights analysis, and really meant to capture the range of harm that was happening to women and to put it in a way that women felt empowered to articulate their own rights. This was really the main point of the campaign and the report, was so that the women who were directly impacted by these violations could have a tool that they could use in their own organizing at the local level and at the state level to articulate the policies they wanted to see and the change that they wanted to make in order to do that. We also did some videos and wrote up personal stories that we felt would help focus the attention on women and not on the sort of technical aspects of the policies. So then by the time the treaty reviews came around, we had a document that clearly articulated the human rights analysis, and we also had empowered people who were able to talk about it. And so one of the main organizers came with us to Geneva for the ICCPR review in March and talked to the committee, and I think really convinced them that this was a huge problem both at the state and national level. We also really utilized social media so that the community kind of saw her as an ambassador who was speaking about their collective concerns and really bringing a different kind of visibility to the issue, going all the way from the Rio Grande Valley to Geneva to talk about this and to hold Texas accountable. We wrote a bunch of blogs about it, and we ended up getting quite a bit of local press. So all of that was really beneficial, but I would say the main takeaways from that is that number one, it really kept the issue alive during a time when the Texas legislature wasn't in session. They don't meet. They only meet for a few months every 2 years. So we wanted to keep the issue alive, and the reviews helped us do that. Number two, it sustained interest in our report. It kept that document active. And three, it really helped distinguish our approach as a human rights one, because we had this human rights treaty process happening. It was so obvious that we were really talking about human rights, and we could talk much more broadly about the issue. And that really helped pave the way for our policy work. So now, what happened is we got some great concluding observations that really urged the government to ensure access to adequate health care for both undocumented and documented immigrants, with a focus on their reproductive health. Then in August, we went back to the CERD committee, and they echoed these concluding observations using even stronger language. And they called on the U.S. to pay attention to how these policies affect racial disparities in health for immigrants, and talked about it as an issue of racial discrimination. And now we're going to bring it back to the Committee Against Torture in November. We're kind of aiming for a triple header here, where we can talk about how, because these women face multiple forms of discrimination, the denial of reproductive health care access can amount to ill treatment for some, particularly those who are now suffering from cervical cancer, which is entirely preventable, but they couldn't get the care they needed at the time they needed it. And so we're taking these concluding observations back to Texas. As Risa mentioned, there's not like blue helmets from the UN who are going to enforce these concluding observations, so we need to think more creatively about how to hold governments accountable. And the way that we're doing that is, again, using these concluding observations to amplify the work on the ground that's already happening. So we're drafting a policy blueprint for the state of Texas when they meet again in January, the legislature, and integrating the human rights analysis into that. We're organizing the whole document around a human rights frame, but really, also drawing on the concluding observations for that support. And we'll also have a human rights hearing in the Rio Grande Valley, so that because women in that community can't really travel due to their immigration status, we're going to bring the human rights experts to them so that they can hear from women in their own context. And we'll do that in the middle of the legislative session on International Women's Day on March 8th. And we've enlisted the U.S. Human Rights Network as a partner in that, which we're excited about. So just to wrap up, I would say that the human rights framework has really helped us bring urgency to this issue and to talk about it in a really different way than how it was talked about in Texas. Of course, the challenge is that, as Jamil noted, it's a very hostile political climate, both to international law and to reproductive rights. And so, but the good news is that, the Latino constituency in Texas is a growing electoral force, and so people are listening to us, and even when we're delivering messages that they might not have thought about. And we really made a choice to frame our policy, so we know we won't be, sorry, a little bit of background noise. We know we won't be able to accomplish all of these policies in the next legislative session, but we're focusing on 2 or 3 that are a little bit more attainable, that might have bipartisan support. And for those, we're really enlisting local allies like mayors and some friendly state legislators to talk about this with us. So we have a long way to go, but we're sort of taking it step by step, and we really feel like the human rights framework has added a lot of value to that process. So thanks.
Great. Thanks, Katrina, for this these responses. One of the things that were mentioned earlier, that the U.S. has ratified only 3 major human rights treaties. I think that one of the questions on the chat that was, you were talking about the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which was ratified in 1992. The Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, which was ratified in 1994. And the third major human rights treaty is the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which was also ratified in 1994. And as you can see, what's missing there are the the other treaties that were adopted by the international community, by the UN, that specifically target or specifically address the rights of specific groups like women's rights, children's rights, migrants' rights, people who are subjected to forced disappearance, and even the Disability Rights Convention, which is still has not been ratified by the U.S. But one of the things using the existing ratified treaties is to raise issues that the U.S. government has not accepted as a matter of formal ratification, particularly around social economic rights, especially within the context of the CERD, where there's a clear obligation to prevent, prohibit, and end all forms of discrimination, particularly against minorities in access to social economic rights, housing, education, right to even access to other necessities. So with us today, I hope he joined us, because I think when we started he wasn't on the phone, is Toussaint Louser, who is the vice chairman of the Chicago Anti-Eviction Campaign and Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination that reviewed the U.S. record. And I wanted him to share with us his experience working in a grassroots human rights organization. How have you seen groups make the most use of the treaty body's concluding observations? And specifically, how the Chicago Anti-Eviction Campaign plan to make the most of the third concluding observations that we've seen, or we got this summer.
Well, I'm here. This is Toussaint Louser. I do apologize. I was a little bit late getting on the call. We just ended a meeting here in Detroit with the director of the Federal Housing Finance Authority, who oversees several of the companies that really play a large role in the housing market. So I do apologize joining you all a little late. I just want to thank the folks at the U.S. Human Rights Network for putting this call together and also inviting me to be a part of it. And I hope that kind of part of what we've seen as a grassroots organization might be helpful for others in this sort of situation, because a lot of what we do as a human rights housing organization is really driven by the members of our organization, and really driven also, I should say, by the passion of the people who are really at the coalface of a lot of this work, who, oftentimes under-resourced, and really take on this work because it's so close to their hearts. I should start by saying that when it came to the CERD, just the process of engaging with the CERD, and this really, I think, holds true for a lot of the other treaties, and engaging with the CERD in and of itself was helpful, because the language of racial discrimination that's a part of the ICERD speaks to questions of racial disparity as racial discrimination in a way that just kind of colloquially we here in the United States don't take up. And so it's been helpful for us just engaging in that process to see and kind of draw on the legitimacy of the way in which instances of racial practices that produce racial disparities are, within the language of the CERD, language of the ICERD, considered instances of racial discrimination in a way that they aren't necessarily considered just in general in the United States. So let me just say that was one particular way in which the making use of that process has been helping to kind of rigidify and solidify some of our work. There's just a couple points that I wanted to add in terms of how we found the process of addressing and making use of the we've looked to make use of the concluding observations that have come out of the CERD, but also kind of what we've seen generally. For starters, as a group that's involved and really driven by the effort to kind of build a membership base and have a group of folks that we're working with who are directly impacted by the issues that we're concerned about, the the process of receiving those concluding observations has been helpful simply to really kind of politically educate our members and give them a greater sense of why the problems that they're facing are significant, why they're important, why organizing and fighting back against those problems is really essential. And in addition to that, giving them a sense of how the international process works has been one of the more kind of more useful products of really engaging with the treaty body and getting the concluding observations. So we've really tried to see it as a process of really taking an opportunity to raise people's consciousness and give them a greater sense of how kind of different international mechanisms work and what we mean, right? What kind of like the actual content of this question of human right to housing actually exists and what kind of space exists for us to make it real. In addition to that, so one of the things we're doing tangible around this question of kind of politically educating people around using the concluding observations to kind of politically educate our folks is we're looking to do a series of report backs in the communities in which we work around the process of the CERD and also what the concluding observations actually were. Because we had worked with the U.S. Human Rights Network to do several kind of community-based hearings around human rights, and we're looking to partner with several of the other Chicago-based organizations that went to Geneva or participated in the shadow reporting process to really kind of say, okay, just for measures of accountability, for informational purposes, and really to kind of further the work that we do, found. And we're finding that to be a really helpful process just in terms of being accountable in terms of our own work, and also to really give people a sense of this is community that sits out there somewhere, but this is how it's connected to people's everyday lives. That process of setting up those report backs has also been helpful in terms of really trying to get us to think more creatively about which organizations we're working with on a day-to-day basis, who we're in coalition with, and how we can broaden some of the coalitions that we have. So that's one of the other things that we're really looking to as a kind of a productive outcome of participating in the shadow reporting process, going to Geneva, and receiving the concluding observations. This is an opportunity for us to link up with other organizations we might not work with on a regular basis, right? People who aren't necessarily doing work in housing, people who aren't necessarily doing work on questions of homelessness. Here are other organizations that are operating within the human rights framework, who are addressing issues of racial discrimination, who we can look to partner with. And even if they're not membership-based organizations, they might have capacities that help further our own work, and we might have ways in which we can really partner with them and help them fulfill some of their missions. In addition to that really coalition-building aspect of the kind of how we're looking to make use of the concluding observations, in addition to working with other sort of elements of civil society, we're also looking at engaging various different state actors, particularly local officials in the short term. And that's one thing that we've seen as being really a kind of an interesting aspect of that oftentimes, while state and local officials might not be very familiar with the UN process, they, sometimes we can get some traction in terms of getting buy-in on a local level for them to take up some of what's been found in the concluding observations. And really we're looking to do that more so in the short term. Over the long term, what we're really trying to do, and this I think speaks to some of what the other folks on the call will address, is really trying to find ways to bring what's been found in the concluding observations into a legislative intervention and a policy intervention that will come over the long term. So here in Chicago and in Illinois, what we're really interested in moving forward are questions of moratoriums on foreclosure and eviction on shortening the process for folks who are dealing with vacant and abandoned properties to acquire them, to really kind of use the concluding observations to help undergird some of the ways in which we're going to be pushing on local and state officials to move forward in a direction that helps to further our mission of achieving the human right to housing.
Great. Thanks so much, Tuso, and appreciate joining us. I know that you have a very busy day today, and we appreciate it. And please, if you can stay with us, we may have some questions coming in from folks on the line. So I want to turn now to another participant and panelist with us who has also been participating in the third review process. In the last summer, spent the week with other advocates in Geneva. And Farah Tanis is now the executive director. She's also the co-founder of Black Blueprint, and she's going to talk a little bit more with us about how the third review they've been able to push the organization's work in ending violence against women of color. This is another great example of how the intersectionality between gender and race in the human rights framework, and how these reviews offer opportunity for organizations like the Black Women's Blueprint to push forward and to advance the agenda, the more progressive agenda that doesn't only look at race without a gender impact, but both. So, Farah, if you could share with us your plan in using the concluding observations, and how do you think this will advance the Black Women's Blueprint in your work here in the different communities that you're working in?
Absolutely. Thank you again for having me. It was a pleasure and an honor to participate to engage in the third process in Geneva, and to really look at the concluding observations and see that Black women are named within this convention that is a convention to end racial discrimination. And so that really speaks to the intersections. And this is really, when we look at the third concluding observations, and we look at the way that we engaged in the third process, and we kept folks at the grassroots very much connected to the work that we were doing, it's absolutely re-energized every one of us at the grassroots level, at the intersections in the movement to end gender violence and sexual violence against Black women specifically. But to really get to, what it is, how it is, this is really helping us, and how it's building legitimacy. It's building legitimacy for the work that we're doing. It's building legitimacy, I think, for the movement, around the movement, and within the movement to end violence, because there has been an acknowledgement, and when you look at the third concluding observations, their naming of African American women, their naming of their concerns about the disproportionate number of women from racial and ethnic minorities that are experiencing rape and sexual violence, specifically, they name that, and they're naming their statement that the U.S. meet its obligations to allocate adequate resources. That is extremely affirming for us at the grassroots. So we have been emboldened, our membership has been emboldened, allies that we have tried to get on board and engage with us, those who have access to particular spaces around policy, have reached out to us and are beginning to join this movement. And these are allies engaged and steeped in the racial justice movement. And so they're beginning to see the centrality of the experiences of Black women and girls, and other women and girls of color, and those from communities, the LGBTQ community, as central to those racial justice issues. So we are, as a result of the concluding observations, we are using that, and we're using the work that we've done specifically to intensify our engagement of local and state actors. And so we're building on the work already happening in New York City, by the Urban Justice Center, for example, to grade city council members based on their human rights records, by New York City Council Human Rights Report Card as a tool for education and for action. So these are designed to advance the use of a human rights framework in policy evaluation and advocacy. It's also providing us with the opportunity, as it measures the commitment of the New York City Council to promote human rights. So we're using this work to end gender violence. We're using the work to end gender violence, and are in the process of scheduling meetings with key New York City Council members in order to offer them a strategy to build a human rights record by either making a statement about the particular language in the concluding observations, which articulates the problem of rape and domestic violence against women of color as a human rights issue, as a human rights concern that they themselves acknowledge. We're using this opportunity to analyze and strategize around particular local policy. But more currently, we're engaging City Council in support of a citywide, culturally competent public space campaign which will educate community about sexual assault as a human rights violation, framing it within that language. Lastly, we're continuing to engage in administrative advocacy at the local level, really connecting specifically with the language in the concluding observations and also in the U.S.'s own report that speak to their obligation to provide adequate resources and funding for communities of color themselves to do the work to address gender violence from within communities, from within empowered communities, which, of course, will lessen our reliance on a criminal justice system which both perpetuates and perpetrates violence against our entire communities. So that's really how we're using it. We also are doing some work at the federal level. We're building on work that we've done already at the federal level. And last year, actually for the past few years, as a direct result of advocacy by Black Women's Blueprint, we were able to win results to specific demands to the Office on Violence Against Women under the Department of Justice to give a fair chance to Black organizations seeking anti-violence resources from VAWA-designated funds, and also to include language that is inclusive of Black African-American populations. We were able to engage the Office on Violence Against Women as allies so they could rewrite their statutory purposes that make explicit the linguistic and culturally specific needs of African Americans and all Black communities in primary prevention of violence, and include more people of color on their peer review panels who make these critical decisions on which organizations get funding. They make those decisions. And so for the first time after that advocacy a couple of years ago, the VAWA grant pool in question actually addressed the specific case of African Americans, and it was named there. We saw this as just though a first step in the right direction, because any organization seeking to serve Black and African American communities, one of the other successes was that now these organizations could be held accountable for solid race and gender, sexuality analysis in doing the work, and that doing the work required an examination of the dynamics of culture and its impact on victimization and healing, and the dynamic of a state that is oppressive and its impact on those communities. So the work continues. This advocacy now can be bolstered by the work that we've done with CERD. It takes the people to really push this forward, and the people being re-energized it's so invaluable. And so as we do this ongoing work, we still see low numbers of funding and grants and resources allocated to communities of African descendants to build their capacity to address gender violence within the context of racial justice. And so we are going to be using our work with CERD. We're going to be using this language to once again, and as someone said earlier in the presentation, not approach the federal government, or not approach of course, the Office on Violence Against Women as an adversary, but as an ally, which we already are, to really talk about the importance and the centrality of really ensuring that communities have it in their hands to hold each other accountable for each other's human rights and really decrease the amount of funding, which is a disproportionate amount of funding that goes towards criminal justice solutions. So that's really, in short, what it is that we are doing, and we're extremely excited about the work.
That sounds really great. Thanks so much for sharing with us your plans and your work. And finally, I wanna bring to the conversation Angelo Pinto, who is the campaign manager for the Raise the Age campaign. He's with the Correctional Association of New York Juvenile Justice Project. It's part of the Correctional Association of New York as well. And he's also been in part of the recent CERD review and been doing exciting work at the local and state level. And wanted to ask specifically if you share with us, if you can also keep them to to 4 or 5 minutes so that we can move back to the other panelists with one couple more additional questions. What are some of the ways that you have begun to take this work, to continue the advocacy that you've done in Geneva? Tell us more about how you're incorporating or planning to incorporate it into your campaigns, and particularly the other fashions that you engage with international actors. I know that there was some work with the Special Rapporteur. Angelo?
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you to the U.S. Human Rights Network, and thank you for all the panelists. I second everything that they've said thus far. So my name is Angelo Pinto, and I work on the Raise the Age campaign. Just a quick background. New York State is one of 2 states that automatically prosecutes 16 and 17-year-olds as adults for any crime. New York also prosecutes 13, 14, and 15-year-olds as adults for certain crimes. And in New York, if you're a 16 or 17-year-old charged as an adult, you will be housed in an adult jail or prison. So that's essentially what the Raise the Age campaign seeks to address. Upon coming into, working with folks, I actually started to partner with CUNY Law School's Human Rights Clinic. And this is maybe about a year ago, not even a year ago, and we engaged a special rapporteur to come in. We were trying to really bring attention to the rights of the children. And so we asked them to come in. We actually had to sit down with them and gave them the opportunity to visit Rikers Island, to visit the 16 and 17-year-olds housed as adults in Rikers Island, and also a facility called Green in New York State, where most of the 16 and 17-year-olds are housed in adult prisons. From there, our main focus is really creating publicity and raising awareness around the issue, which we did through press conferences. As CERD came around, we began having a discussion about really issuing a shadow report and taking some of the work we've done with the Special Rapporteur to the next level. For me, really being new to the work, I think what was important was really to get a clear understanding of exactly what CERD was. I really had to do my research and understand exactly where the issue of youth being prosecuted as adults housed in adults facilities fits into CERD. And from there, really, shaping a shadow report that was useful and that would hopefully get us mentioned in some concluding observations. I think engaging in the experience going to Geneva taught me a tremendous amount, which I don't necessarily have time to go into. But one of the things that allowed us to do coming back to New York was really continuing to spread the word and raise awareness around what we did there and the concluding observations. So we immediately issued a press release, and that press release really was to serve a couple of purposes. One was to let the statewide community, the statewide individuals working on this issue and people who may not be aware of the issue, that this issue is a human rights issue. It's not just an issue in local jails and an issue in state prisons, but it's an international issue that has international precedent backing it. For us, and I think for other folks around the country working on these issues, using the international and human rights language allows you to place a different lens on the issue. It can also give you the opportunity to kind of invigorate some of the individuals working on the ground who may not be getting as much traction as you. So the language and the press release and even local events was a way for us to do that. The other piece why that was important, particularly the press release and even smaller events, was we were able to begin to really engage community members around what was this human rights stuff that we were doing, why was it important, where did it fit. Many folks in the community, for instance, were not particularly where that 16 and 17-year-olds were prosecuted as adults to begin with, let alone that this was, in violation of some human rights. So we had to really do a lot of educating of the community members to let them know this is a standard, this is a precedent that can be useful, not only when educating other community members, but when we go to Albany or when we have our legislative visits with senators and assembly members to let them know that this is an issue that they need to be championing. Not only is this issue, is New York out of step with the rest of the country, but in a lot of ways New York is behind the rest of the world, an international precedent. And that language really, I think, gives the issue a different kind of gravity. The other piece that was important, and things just kind of fell in place for us in a lot of ways, maybe a week or two after, or maybe 3 weeks after coming back from Geneva, there was a tremendous amount of press around Rikers Island and the 16 and 17-year-olds on Rikers Island. The federal government actually issued a report stating all the issues that was taking place on Rikers Island with 16 and 17-year-olds. Subsequently, a week after that, Rikers Island or Department of Corrections staff said that, they would be taking 16 and 17-year-olds out of solitary confinement. So the issue got a lot of publicity. What it's created for us last week and even this week is a tremendous amount of opportunities to discuss what's the relevance, what's the significance of 16 and 17-year-olds being taken out of Rikers Island. And it's given us the ability to say, well, this is a good step, but this step isn't far enough, particularly because we were already out of step with human rights standards and international law. So it's given us the ability to now place more pressure on elected officials, place more pressure on the Department of Corrections, actually as a result of something that the federal government has done to say this is why this issue is important. This is why we haven't met the standard. This is why, we need to actually go further and take all young people out of adult prisons altogether. The other piece which has been very interesting is that this has really been the first opportunity for the Correctional Association of New York to engage our issues, and we deal with a variety of issues of folks involved in the criminal justice system. We're one of 2 organizations in the country that has a legislative mandate to monitor prison conditions. So it has given us the opportunity and has allowed us to begin having the conversations about how do we begin to shift the language of all of the work we do, not just for children who are prosecuted as adults or children in youth facilities or youth detention, but women in prison and men in prison. How do we begin to shift the language so that it embodies what we've continued to do in the humanity that we, kind of take into our work, but how do we begin to include international standards and human rights language as a part of, kind of our tool belt as we do the work we do. And I think part of why that has become so important or interesting, I think, for the organization to really explore is that oftentimes many issues, particularly when you talk about vulnerable populations, individuals aren't interested in having the conversation. Individuals look at these particular groups as folks who are getting what they deserve or don't deserve to get more. And I think when you are able to put a human rights standard on there, when you're able to bring international standards into the fray of the discussion, I think it changes discussion. And it makes the United States and it makes New York specifically and even localities look at themselves differently, particularly because oftentimes New York State and I think even the United States believes that it's ahead of the world and that of course we're doing things right. Of course we're upholding humane standards when in fact most of the times we're not. So it's really begun to give the organization an opportunity to say, how do we reshape our messaging? How do we begin to include this as a tool in what we do? And more importantly, and I think as the months and even the years ahead, how do we begin to engage the community to understand that, having a lens, having a frame of human rights and international standards is important to the work we do. So I will stop there so that we can begin to have a bit of a Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this, Angelo. I realize we are over. I think we've already behind in terms of our schedule. But what I want to do here is we wanted to address a couple more questions to the panelists. But what I really want to do is, because we do have another case study that's an interesting one coming from the ACLU of New Mexico, I'd like to just ask Risa and Katrina, if based on what you've heard in the last 3 presentations from Angelo, Farah, and Toussaint, if there's one tip or advice that you could give local governments and to push the issues and to build a movement on the local and state level that is grounded with respect for human rights? What would be that very short, we don't have more than maybe 2 minutes. That would be great if you can be brief.
Sure, I can start. This is Risa. First of all, this is all very inspiring, the work that folks are doing. You all are doing amazing work. So I don't have a lot to add. I would just say, in terms of having these messages resonate with state and local officials, I think it's always nice to start with where they are and also start with what they're already doing that's positive, and really emphasize how compliance with the concluding observations or other provisions of the treaty obligations can really enhance their goals to ensure equality and progress and opportunity. And as I said before, I think it's always important, to the extent that you can, as it was mentioned in New York City, identifying some champions, like a wedge within, because I think state and local officials listen probably most, obviously to their constituencies, but also to their peers. So I think to the extent that you can identify champions and have them help you in spreading the word.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, and just underscore the point about making sure that you have that you're trying to connect the human rights processes to a strong movement on the ground, and having those local voices really well educated about the human rights process and something that's really that they own themselves and talk about as something that they feel changed and inspired by. Because I think that, like Farah talked about, just the way that it not only re-energized the movement but also gave them more legitimacy for their work. I think that that's something we've really seen in the Rio Grande Valley as well. As women have begun to participate more in these processes and understand more about them, they've really owned that, and that's been reflected back by the local leaders who have listened to them in this sort of different way. So that's
Great.
That's definitely something that I took away from the conversation. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jamil and panelists. Jamil, did you have something you wanted to add before I move on to the next section?
No, I just wanted to thank everyone so far on the panel sorry that we are running behind, but hopefully we'll have maybe 5 to 10 minutes at the end for additional questions. If you're able to join the chat, there are some people posting questions, responding by please engage at this level. We are hoping to cover more in the last part. But thank you so much for the panelists, and we're looking forward to the second part. Yulan?
Yes, thanks so much, Jamil, and to all our panelists whose bios are available on our website. Next, we have Vicky Galbeca, who is the director of the ACLU of New Mexico Regional Center for Border Rights. And Vicky will be talking to us about how the specific concluding observation that they received as participating in the ICCPR process was really beneficial in the larger campaign that they were waging in the New Mexico border region. Vicky?
Great. Thank you so much for having me on. Since we're pretty limited on time, I'm going to try to condense my comments, but I just want to say first off that we've already heard some very successful, powerful case studies, in my opinion, and I'll hope to do some justice to these. As some of you may know, our mission is basically the Regional Center for Border Rights for the ACLU of New Mexico is to address human and civil rights violations that stem from border-specific immigration policy. And so that most of, in that context, most of our policy changes that we seek are at the federal level, and our advocacy is directly mostly to top officials at the sector level and in Washington, D.C., but certainly we can't do this without the support of community leaders, elected officials, and local law enforcement who help us in this advocacy. And this actually happens at the state, but also, at the local and the state, but also at the regional level. We work with the 4 Southwest ACLU border affiliates in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, and San Diego, but also with our national offices, the Human Rights Program, and our Washington Legislative Office in D.C. But we're also a coalition which brings together about 60 organizations from and their respective local members from San Diego to Brownsville to ensure that border enforcement policies and practices are accountable and fair, respect human dignity and human rights, and prevent the loss of life in the region. And so while militarization of the U.S.-Mexico border has come with a host of human and civil rights violations, we decided in the last couple of years to make the issue of excessive use of force our top priority, with a lens of bringing more accountability and oversight to what is now the largest law enforcement agency in the nation. So just as a quick, I like that Katrina gave a little bit of context to the background of the problem. Since January 2010, there have been along both the southern and the northern border at least 29 deaths that have been the result of CBP's agents using lethal force. Of these 29, 6 were of actually Mexican nationals standing in Mexico when shot and killed, 3 of whom were teenagers aged 15, 16, and 17. At least 12 of these individuals who died were U.S. citizens. One was a U.S. citizen, 32-year-old mother of 5, Valerie Monique Taquitin, and her family recently held a vigil in San Diego to mark the 2-year anniversary of her death. And what the problem is that really not a single agent has been held accountable, even when the circumstances of the shootings have been questionable to internal investigations. So, as I said, this was a regional coalition, and so we developed a campaign that involved community organizing along with border and strategic communications. We met with directly affected community members and witnesses, developed and implemented a media advocacy campaign, enlisted local elected officials, and went to D.C. with family members, made Hill visits, and met with the White House, for example, domestic policy staff. So the ICCPR was actually part of a larger campaign to bring accountability and oversight to U.S. Customs and Border Protection, particularly on the issue of excessive use of force. And so right before the ICCPR review, we actually coordinated a sign-on letter that was endorsed by more than 75 local, state, regional, and national organizations, and we actually hand-delivered this to the UN Human Rights Committee, a section of which was read by the representative from South Africa, and then specific members of the committee actually made some very specific requests to the U.S. government during the review. And then the concluding observations really became the tip of our escalation arc to make the agency more accountable. We referred to these concluding observations in press release and social media and with new meetings with Customs and Border Protection and White House top officials and with sector leaders along the border. And I really have to say that since the concluding observations, the agency, I think as part of, this growth of local to state to national, federal to international pressures, it really has led to more transparency and accountability and oversight, which the agency has recently announced. So, for example, on May 30th, they released an unredacted internal audit that was conducted by the Police Executive Research Forum, which was very damaging on use of force and provided some very key recommendations. They also released a completely revised use of force manual that included recommendations made by the ACLU on use of force. In June, they actually removed the head of internal affairs, and he was replaced by Mark Morgan, who was detailed from the FBI. And the same person who was removed actually later on, his name is James Tomchek, came out saying that the agency had covered up highly suspect deaths in clashes along the southern border and stated that at least 7 of the deaths along the border were highly suspect. On September 12, Mark Morgan, who's the interim head of internal affairs, announced that they did an administrative review of 860 cases and concluded that 155 warranted further examination. Then on September 18, the agency announced that they had been granted authority to basically conduct their own investigations on their own personnel. And part of that new review process included the creation of an integrity advisory panel. The agency has also promised to be more forthcoming with the use of deadly force and established a rapid reaction force of investigators whose missions will be to gather evidence following incidents and allegations of abuse. And finally, and very importantly, thanks to a lot of the advocacy of local police chiefs and sheriffs who were able to come and advocate with us, the agency has also recently announced that they're going to be testing body-worn cameras at their training academy as a first step towards introducing these body-worn cameras in the field. And as you may know, video footage of encounters between uniformed law enforcement and civilians has been increasing a lot with positive results. So there still is a lot more work to be done. We will continue to monitor how they implement the new use of force policy. We hope to see in the next years agents who have engaged in excessive use of force being held accountable, along with transparent investigations, and we hope to see the body-worn cameras fully implemented. But I think all of these recent accomplishments would not have been possible without the participation of our local and state community leaders, and through this arc of escalation that ended not ended, but sort of came to a height there at the review of the ICCPR.
Now into our Q&A portion. And again, there are two ways you can participate in the conversation. The first is by using the raise hand feature, which is at the top of your computer screen. It says My Mood, and you will go down to see a button that says raise hand, and then we'll recognize you to speak. Or you can do as folks have been doing, to put forward a question to our panelists. And I see that our presenters have been answering the questions. So if you are online, then you can participate in that conversation that way. So one of the first questions that we have is about, and I think maybe Risa, this might be directed towards you, which is, have you had situations where local governments have shown themselves to be more motivated to improve their human rights record as a result of issues raised in the UN treaty body review processes?
So thanks for the question. I mean, I guess I would say we've identified folks, and folks have identified themselves as being very interested in this process and engaging with the human rights framework, and so progress is slow. But some of the examples that I identified, I think, are places where there's an opening, and where we need to continue. Advocates need to really continue to push for concrete compliance. But there are small pockets that I think are really exciting. So, San Francisco, as I mentioned, is one. I mentioned places where city councils have taken on sort of an affirmance of human rights principles and human rights principles through the right to housing, the right to be free from domestic violence. So the short answer is yes. I think that there's an openness, and it's an opportunity for us to then go into the opening and really push for compliance.
Fantastic. Thanks, Risa. And this question is directed specifically at Toussaint. So if you're on the phone, please address this. And it says, in the process of engaging grassroots, have you found it helpful to involve community artists, so poets, painters, storytellers, to help with the political education of folks?
Well, first of all, thank you. I think that's a great question. We've, in our general organizing, really try to engage artists on a regular basis. We really haven't worked out exactly what's the best way to kind of directly engage artists, specifically around the concluding observations, but just the general question of engaging artists and cultural workers and what have you is something that's really helped our organizing a lot, because I think the issue that we have to deal with as a kind of grassroots organization, as a membership-based organization, especially around housing, but this is also an issue that relates to kind of like criminal justice issues and things of that nature, is there's a lot of shame around the particular issue, the particular question of human rights violations, right? And even though we understand, in our organization, we understand the question of people losing their homes as a violation of the human rights, it's almost as if the way in which the process occurs, people understand that simply as their own failing. And being able to push people past that sense of shame and that sense of individual failure to kind of understand the larger systemic context in which, this is a question of foreclosure, a question of eviction is taking place, or a question of homelessness takes place, is really, really, really important just to get people involved in our organizing effort. And so the work that we've done in the past with hip-hop artists who have performed at our events, who have, participated at fundraisers, who have done like music videos around the actions that we do, it has really been very, very helpful. Like I said, we haven't necessarily sort of figured out how to work the concluding observations into some of that culture work, but we even have a documentary that we try to give out to people that was put together by some documentary filmmakers, which, covers our work and also gives other people around the country almost kind of a template for how they can think about doing this sort of organizing. So I think it's a great question, and I wish I had a better example than saying this is something that we're still sort of figuring out, but it is.
Thanks so much, Jason. This next question, and anyone can answer it, it's concerning protecting human rights defenders, specifically whistleblowers, who are citizens who expose, name, shame, officials who have abused their power and authority. And so the question is, how do we protect them from this type of illegal retaliation, specifically whistleblowers?
Well, I would try to answer that question quickly. This is Angelo Pinto. I think one of the best ways to protect whistleblowers, I think it's kind of an approach we use when we try to protect voices of children or family members speaking about ways in which they have been mistreated, is really to have them kind of express their concerns in coalition. So having the folks that they're expressing this issue to know that they're not doing this as an isolated individual voicing concern of this issue, but they're doing this as a result of being a partner in coalition with a variety of organizations, a number of individuals who have the same concerns and who may have experienced the same thing. So I think coalition is one mechanism that can provide support.
And this is Katrina. I think in addition to that, there's some specific international mechanisms that can be used to protect human rights defenders, and beyond the category of whistleblowers, but defenders generally. There's a UN Special Rapporteur on human rights defenders that many of us in the U.S. have submitted complaints to, and that rapporteur can send a letter of requesting the U.S. government to conduct an investigation and kind of escalate it up to an international level. So there's more information on the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights website about how to take advantage of that mechanism. It's a really simple procedure. You don't need to be a lawyer to use it. And it can help gain attention, sort of heightened attention to threats against defenders, all kinds of threats, from losing their jobs or losing their employment to arbitrary arrest to acts committed by private actors, non-state officials against these defenders. So I encourage you to check it out. And I think the network is also trying to create a member-initiated action team around the specific issues, so you can stay tuned about that too.
No, thanks so much, Angelo and Katrina. And Katrina is exactly right. If you do have an interest in working with other USHRN members on issues of human rights defenders broadly and whistleblowers specifically, do reach out to us about being a part of that or co-chairing that committee. So just in the interest of time, we're going to take one more question, and then I'm going to, show you, point out where you guys can find the resources related to this webinar and others. So this is both a comment and a question, which is clearly the ratified human rights treaties are significantly better primed for state and local implementation, and the presenters are doing a fascinating. So the person is curious about whether or not, if any of the panelists have successfully leveraged the symbolic power of treaties that are signed but not ratified for local implementation. And I know Katrina shared specifically about the work of CEDAW in San Francisco in the chat area. So I don't know if folks want to point out one other that they can share with folks who may not be online but are listening over the phone.
So this is, Risa, I'm just going to say briefly, this is probably the subject of another U.S. Human Rights Network webinar, but the Universal Periodic Review is a great opportunity for folks to think about the whole panoply of human rights that the U.S. and state and local governments are obliged to comply with. And so I think there are lots of opportunities there to report on human rights violations and to bring those recommendations back to the state and local level.
Awesome. Thanks, Risa. And I'm not sure what happened to our PowerPoint presentation, but it had a lovely slide thanking Jamil Dakwar, who is the outgoing chair of the ICCPR task force, for his leadership over the last 2 years in terms of getting us through the review process, and even now in the post-review process and the follow-up work that we're doing. So I want to thank Jamil for his leadership, his visionary, leadership, if you will, for all the work that he's done. And I also want to welcome Katrina Anderson as the incoming co-chair, who will be serving with Nazrina Bargzi of the Asian Law Caucus, formerly Asian Law Caucus, but Asian Americans Advancing Justice. So Jamil, if you could hear the folks on the line, they're clapping and saying thank you for all the work that you've done. And Jamil will remain with the task force as a member.
Thanks so much, Yolande, and I also want to thank everyone who is on the task force and the larger community of what we call the human rights and the ICCPR community in particular, who participated over the last couple of years. It's been an honor, and I'm happy that Katrina is going to take the baton and continue this work. It's the more challenging part of the work that we are embarking on, which is the implementation part. And so I'm happy to be part of the task force and wish Katrina and Nasrina best of luck in leading us next level.
So there's my slide for you, Jamil.
Thanks so much.
And just as we conclude, I want to say this is the link here that you can actually click through to get to the page where you can find later today an orientation, a full list, and photos of our speakers with their bios. There you'll also find guides on implementing the conclusion, observations, and recommendations from CERD and the UPR, as well as a guide on how to work with local governments and officials, all of which are presented to you by the Human Rights Institute at Columbia Law School. As well, and because of the size of it, we're having some problems putting it up, but it should be there shortly, are examples of local human rights resolutions that have already been passed. So I encourage you to, check out the page, and if you don't see some of those resources there, check back. They'll be there by tomorrow. And so thank you all for participating in this. And finally, if you are not already a member of the U.S. Human Rights Network, we invite you to join the movement by becoming a member of the network. And if you have questions for our panelists, please do reach out to them individually or to me or my colleagues at the network, and be sure to get your question to them. And I want to thank Risa, Toussaint, Angelo, Farah, Jamil, Vicky, and I'm forgetting someone, and Katrina for the excellent presentations today. You guys did fantastic, and I'm sorry we didn't have time to answer all the questions that you've presented to our speakers, but we'll do our best to try to address those through subsequent emails and also presentations. Thank you all.
And thank you, Yolanda.
No, thank you. I appreciate it.